On a Thursday afternoon in August of 1994, on 12,000 acres of high desert grazing land in Nevada's Ruby Mountains, the ground opened up and swallowed a $3 million pump station. The drought had been building for 3 years. Not unusual for the Great Basin, Nevada is desert country, and desert country has dry years the way other places have rain. But this drought was different. The aquifer that fed the Ruby Valley ranches had been dropping steadily since 1991, and what the ranching syndicate didn't know was that as the water table fell, it was leaving behind underground cavities where the hydrostatic pressure had been holding the limestone formations together. When the pressure dropped far enough, the rock stopped holding. The collapse happened at 14:23 hours during a routine maintenance check. The pump station foreman felt the ground shift beneath his feet and had exactly enough time to step backward before the surface crust gave way. A circle 20 feet across simply dropped, taking with it the concrete pump housing, the motor assembly, the distribution manifold, and 45 tons of precision irrigation equipment. The foreman stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at $3 million lying 30 feet below him in a cloud of limestone dust. The ranching syndicate called the Nevada Water Authority. The Water Authority sent engineers. The engineers brought ground-penetrating radar and subsidence assessment tools and laptop computers with geological modeling software. By evening, they had their conclusion. "The subsidence is still active," said the lead engineer, a man named Patrick Holloway, who had been with the Water Authority for 11 years. "We're measuring continued movement on the eastern wall of the cavity. Any recovery attempt puts personnel at risk and could trigger secondary collapse. The equipment is a total loss." The ranch operations manager, a man named Gerald Fitch, who ran the syndicate's Nevada properties, stood at the cavity edge and looked at what represented roughly 40% of the ranch's infrastructure value. Options: drill a new well, position it away from the subsidence zone, new pump station, 12 to 14 months minimum before you're operational. We lose the summer grazing season. And probably the fall, Holloway said. "I'm sorry, the geology doesn't give us better options." Fitch looked at the hole, at the pump station, at 12,000 acres of high desert that needed water every day. "Get the insurance adjuster out here," he said. That's when the Sterling wrecker came up the ranch road. Let me tell you about Ignacio Arusha, because you need to understand the man before you understand what he did. Iggy was 73 years old in 1994. His full name was Ignacio Arusha Anzoátegui, which told anyone who knew Basque names that his family had come from the Pyrenees, from the mountain country between Spain and France, where people had been shepherding and mining since before Rome existed. His grandfather, Paxi Arusha, had come to Nevada in 1906 as part of the Great Basque Migration to the American West. The Basques had a reputation as the finest sheepherders in the world, and Nevada's high desert basins needed sheepherders who could work in country that defeated other men. Paxi had worked sheep in the Ruby Valley for 15 years before saving enough to buy land. In 1921, he filed a homestead claim on 4,200 acres of Ruby Mountains grazing land and began building a small operation: sheep, some cattle, a modest house. He'd been building it for 14 years when the land disappeared. Iggy had grown up hearing fragments of the story: legal disputes, government paperwork, his grandfather fighting for years and losing, the family ending up with nothing but the knowledge of sheep country and desert terrain that no document could take away. Paxi had died in 1941, bitter and unreconciled, but before he died, he'd taught his son everything he knew about Nevada desert, the rock formations, the water table, the underground geology that most people never bothered to understand. His son had taught Iggy. Iggy had spent 50 years doing recovery work across the Nevada basin and range. He'd pulled mining equipment out of desert canyons, drilling rigs from dry riverbeds, construction machinery from terrain that engineers said was inaccessible. In 1949, he'd bought a Sterling S-Series wrecker at a Reno equipment auction. a truck designed for heavy desert recovery, built with the kind of robust simplicity that Nevada mining operations required. He'd been running Arusha Desert Recovery ever since. On that Thursday afternoon, Iggy heard about the Ruby Valley pump station collapse on the Nevada Contractor Radio Network, heard the Water Authority engineers discussing total loss documentation, heard Fitch authorize the insurance adjuster. Iggy put on his canvas hat, started the Sterling first try despite the heat, and drove to the ranch. The security guard at the gate knew Iggy from previous work on other Nevada ranches. He called up to the main site and got authorization. Fitch walked over as Iggy climbed down from the cab. He looked at the Sterling, at Iggy, at the Sterling again. "We are not taking visitors," Fitch said. "Not hostile, just efficient. Active insurance assessment." "I heard," Iggy said. His voice was quiet, shaped by 73 years of desert wind. "Thought I might be able to help." Fitch looked at the Sterling. With that, that truck's got to be 45 years old." 45 years in Nevada desert," Iggy said. "She knows this country." Holloway had walked over from the cavity perimeter. He looked at Iggy, at the Sterling, at the dust that covered every surface of both. "Sir, we've run full geological assessment. The subsidence is active. The cavity walls are unstable. Any attempt to position recovery equipment near the edge." "How deep is the solid caliche layer?" Iggy asked. Holloway stopped. "What?" "Caliche, the hardpan layer. How deep did your ground-penetrating radar show it?" Holloway looked at his tablet. "Approximately 8 to 10 feet below surface across most of the area." "And the limestone bedrock beneath that?" 12 to 15 feet. Iggy nodded. "Then I can anchor to bedrock from 60 feet back from the cavity edge and never put a pound of load on the unstable zone." Holloway started to respond, stopped, looked at his tablet again. Fitch watched this exchange. He'd been running ranch operations for 20 years and had learned to read the moment when an expert's certainty started to develop cracks. "Your assessment assumed surface anchoring," Iggy said. "I use deep anchors. They go through the unstable layer into the caliche, then through the caliche to the limestone. The surface can do whatever it wants. My anchor is in bedrock." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "The equipment weight is 45 tons, Iggy said. "My Sterling puts 30,000 pounds of sustained pull through a 12-stage reduction winch. Run that through a 3-pulley redirect system, and I've got 90,000 pounds of force applied at the right angle." He looked at the cavity. "The pump station wants to come up. Gravity put it down, and gravity will help me bring it up if I rig the angle right. I just have to break the initial suction contact with the cavity floor." Fitch looked at Holloway. Holloway looked at his tablet. His expression had changed from professional dismissal to something more careful. "If this doesn't work," Fitch said to Iggy. "Then you're exactly where you are right now," Iggy said. "No worse." Fitch made a decision that ranch operations managers sometimes have to make. The decision to trust a kind of knowledge that doesn't show up on engineering credentials. "Do it," he said. Holloway opened his mouth. "Document your objections," Fitch said to him. "I'll sign off on the liability." "Let me tell you about the 1949 Sterling S-Series, because understanding the machine is the only way to understand what happened next." The Sterling Motor Trucks Company had been building heavy-duty work vehicles in Milwaukee since 1907. The S-Series, introduced after World War II, was their most capable design for extreme terrain operation: oil fields, mines, desert construction, the kind of work that happened far from paved roads and repair facilities. The Sterling had a straight-eight engine producing about 180 horsepower, but the engine was almost beside the point. What mattered was the winch system, a mechanically driven unit with 12 stages of planetary reduction that multiplied the engine's torque by a factor of 24. 24 times input torque, applied smoothly, continuously, without hydraulic fluid to leak or electronic sensors to fail. Iggy had added one modification that no Sterling had come with from the factory. A deep anchor system he designed himself after a job in 1967 where surface anchors had failed in unstable desert terrain. The anchors were steel rods, 2 inches in diameter and 6 feet long, with expanding heads that deployed when the rod was driven to depth. Iggy drove them through the unstable surface layer, through the caliche hardpan, into the limestone bedrock beneath. When the anchor head expanded in the limestone, it was essentially impossible to pull out without breaking the rock itself. He positioned 6 of them in a rectangle 60 feet from the cavity edge. In ground he'd tested by walking it, tapping it, reading the sound the way his grandfather had read tunnel geology in Nevada silver mines in the 1920s. The ranch hands watched from a distance. Holloway was taking photographs and measurements, recalculating. Fitch watched without speaking. Iggy worked in silence, which was how he'd always worked. The desert didn't reward conversation, it rewarded attention. He spent the first hour setting anchors and rigging cable. The cable ran from the Sterling's winch drum through a 3-pulley redirect system that changed the pulling direction from horizontal to an angle that would apply maximum vertical force to the pump station below. The attachment point was the hardest part. Iggy had to descend into the cavity to reach the pump station structure, not all the way down, but far enough to hook his cable to a frame member that would take the load without the connection point failing first. He rigged a rope descent system, tested it twice, and went down. The ranch hands, who'd been watching from shade, walked closer. Holloway stopped taking photographs and just watched. An old man descended 30 feet into a collapsed cavity in unstable desert terrain, alone, with a rope and a cable end. Fitch later said it was the most matter-of-fact act of courage he'd ever seen. Iggy didn't announce it, didn't ask for backup, didn't check with anyone. He just went down because that's what the job required. He was down there for 12 minutes. When he came back up, he was covered in limestone dust and moving slowly, 73-year-old joints objecting to the climb, but his face was as calm as it had been when he arrived. He walked back to the Sterling without speaking, checked his rigging one more time, and climbed into the cab. Let me tell you about the pull, because that's what everyone at that ranch talked about for years afterward. Iggy started the winch at 17:15 hours, 2 hours after he'd arrived. The Sterling's engine note changed as the planetary reduction engaged, a deep mechanical sound that was different from any modern hydraulic system. Slower, more deliberate. The cables went taut. The bedrock anchors took the load. The Sterling's frame settled on its suspension without moving. The anchors were doing exactly what Iggy had said they would do, transferring force into limestone 60 feet below the surface. For 5 minutes, nothing visible happened. Holloway was watching his subsidence sensors. The cavity walls were not moving. The secondary collapse he'd predicted wasn't happening because none of the load was touching the unstable zone. At the 6-minute mark, something changed in the sound of the winch. A different resistance. The pump station had broken suction contact with the cavity floor. It moved, one of the ranch hands said. Nobody responded. Everyone was watching the cable where it disappeared over the cavity edge. Then the cable angle changed. Infinitesimally at first, a fraction of a degree as the pump station below shifted from resting on the cavity floor to hanging in suspension. Then more clearly as the weight redistributed and Iggy opened the throttle slightly. Iggy kept the pull steady. No sudden increases, no adjustments. The same sustained force that had been moving Nevada desert equipment since 1949. 20 minutes after the pull began, the top of the pump station's motor housing appeared at the cavity edge. Nobody cheered, nobody spoke. They watched in the particular silence of people witnessing something they'd been told was impossible. 30 minutes. The pump housing was at grade level, being dragged across the desert surface towards solid ground. 45 minutes after Iggy started the winch, the entire pump station sat on solid caliche 20 feet from the cavity edge, covered in limestone dust and damaged in 3 places, but structurally intact, and a structural engineer would later confirm fully repairable. Iggy shut down the winch, set the brake, climbed out of the cab. He began coiling cable. Fitch walked over. He stood there for a moment watching Iggy work in the fadding afternoon heat. "I don't know what to say," Fitch said. "Don't need to say anything," Iggy said. "Equipment's out, that's the job. You went down into that cavity alone. Needed to set the cable. That took courage." Iggy looked up. That took a rope and knowing how to read limestone. He went back to work. "Courage is what your grandfather showed when they took his land, and he kept going anyway." Fitch stopped. "I'm sorry." Iggy hadn't planned to say it. It had come out the way things come out when a man is tired and has been thinking about something for a long time. "Nothing," Iggy said. "Old thought." Fitch looked at him. Something in the way Iggy had said it, the specific weight of the words, stayed with him. "What do we owe you?" Fitch asked. "Standard contractor rate. My office will invoice." "That's not. There has to be something more." Iggy thought for a moment. Basque Cultural Center in Elko. They're trying to restore a sheepherder's wagon for their heritage display. Donate whatever you think pulling that station out of the ground was worth. Fitch made a call. The syndicate authorized a $20,000 donation to the Elko Basque Cultural Center before Iggy had finished loading his cable. Iggy nodded, climbed into the Sterling, and drove back down the ranch road. As the old truck disappeared into the Ruby Mountains dust, Holloway stood with his tablet, looking at subsidence readings that showed no secondary collapse, no wall movement, no evidence that what he'd said was impossible had just been done. "I need to revise my anchoring assumptions," Holloway said quietly. "Yes," Fitch said, "you do. But the story doesn't end there. Let me tell you what happened 7 weeks later, because that's when Iggy made the discovery." The Sterling had been making a faint harmonic rattle since the Ruby Valley recovery. Somewhere in the cab structure, something had shifted under the sustained load of pulling 45 tons. Not a mechanical problem, just a resonance. Iggy pulled the truck into his shop in Elko, a concrete block building he'd owned since 1961, and began tracing the sound. He found it in the passenger-side tool compartment, a custom-fabricated steel box his grandfather Paxi had built into the truck's structure when Iggy's father first bought it in 1949. Iggy had used that compartment for 45 years to store small tools and spare parts. He'd never had reason to remove the compartment itself. The rattle was coming from inside the compartment's double-wall construction, not from inside the compartment where he stored things, from inside the walls. Iggy removed the compartment from the truck, tapped the walls. One section was hollow. Someone had built a void space into the compartment wall and sealed it with a welded panel that had been ground smooth and painted to match. Invisible unless you were specifically looking. Iggy cut through the weld carefully. Inside, packed in oilcloth against Nevada's temperature extremes, was a sealed tin box. Inside the box, a land document, old. The paper was the heavy linen stock that official documents used before the Depression. The header read, Office of the Surveyor General, Territory of Nevada. Beneath that, Spanish and Mexican land grant confirmation. The document confirmed the Arusha family's claim to 4,200 acres in the Ruby Valley, dated 1851, predating Nevada statehood, with an official seal that Iggy couldn't read but recognized as authentic. A second document, also official. This one from the Nevada Land Office, dated 1928. It described a title dispute resolution in which the Arusha homestead claim had been adjudicated in favor of a competing claimant named the Ruby Valley Land and Cattle Company. A third document, handwritten on Nevada Land Office letterhead, dated 1929 and signed by a deputy land registrar. This one was different from the others. This one was a confession. The deputy registrar, a man named Howard Briggs who had died in 1954, had written that the 1928 adjudication had been conducted fraudulently, that survey records had been altered, that Paxi Arusha's homestead claim had been legally valid and properly filed, that the transfer to the Ruby Valley Land and Cattle Company had been accomplished through falsified documentation, and that Briggs had been paid $800 to process the papers. Briggs had written the confession in 1929, apparently consumed by guilt, and had given it to Paxi Arusha directly. He'd also given Paxi the original 1851 Spanish land grant, which Briggs had located in territorial records and copied before those records were lost in a fire in 1931. $8,900 in currency, mostly 20s and 50s from the 1920s, some sheep-herding wages paid in cash over decades, one bundle bound with a note in Basque, Es dut dina iramen, Ezagutsa Gelditzende. They did not take everything, knowledge remains. And beneath all of it, a letter from Paxi Arusha, written in careful English, that showed the same effort at precision that all first-generation immigrants brought to their adopted language. To whoever finds this, likely my son or grandson. The land was ours. The proof is here. I spent 14 years building on it and 3 years fighting for it, and then I stopped fighting because fighting was making me into someone my sheep would not follow. I am hiding this because I want you to have the choice I did not have clearly. I was too close to it, too angry, too tired. When you find this, you will be far enough away to see it clearly. Here is what I know. The land is still there. The Ruby Valley Land and Cattle Company sold it twice, and it is now in the hands of men who do not know this history. They may be decent men. They did not steal from us directly. The legal question I cannot answer. Whether old papers still have force in new courts, whether the cost of fighting is worth what you might win, a lawyer would know. The moral question I can answer. You did not do anything wrong. Your family did not do anything wrong. Someone took what was ours and papered over it, and we lost, and then we kept living. Keeping living was the right choice. I want you to know I believe that. But I also want you to know what happened. A man should know his own history, even the parts that were taken from him. Do what you think is right. I will not tell you from here what that is. Paxi Arusha, 1935. Iggy sat in his shop for a long time. He was 73 years old. The Ruby Valley Land and Cattle Company had become the ranching syndicate that was now managed by Gerald Fitch. The land had changed hands multiple times since 1928. The men who had committed the fraud were 60 years dead. And Iggy had just spent an afternoon pulling their equipment out of the ground. He thought about that for a while, about what it meant that he'd done it without knowing, about whether it would have changed anything if he'd known. He decided it wouldn't have. The equipment needed pulling. That had nothing to do with who owned the land. He called a lawyer in Reno who specialized in Nevada property law and public land claims. The lawyer spent 2 weeks reviewing the documents. His conclusion was careful and honest. The Spanish land grant and the 1928 fraud documentation were historically significant and legally interesting. But the practical path to recovering the land itself was effectively closed after 66 years of subsequent transfers, improvements, and good faith ownership by parties with no knowledge of the original fraud. What was possible, and what the lawyer strongly recommended, was formal historical documentation. Iggy donated the original Spanish land grant to the Nevada State Museum, where it was authenticated and became part of the permanent collection of pre-statehood land documents. It was, the museum director told him, one of fewer than 30 confirmed Spanish land grants in Nevada's territorial record. The fraud documentation, Briggs's 1929 confession, and the supporting land office records, Iggy donated to the University of Nevada's special collections, where they became primary source material for researchers studying the systematic dispossession of Basque and other immigrant landowners during the 1920s and 1930s. A historian at the university, wrote a paper using the Arusha documents as a case study. The paper was cited in subsequent work on Nevada land history and made its way into the permanent scholarly record of how the Ruby Valley had been settled and who had paid the price for that settlement. Iggy sent Gerald Fitch a letter, not a legal letter, just a letter. It explained what he'd found, what the documents showed, and what he'd done with them. It said nothing about claims or compensation. It ended with one sentence: "I thought you should know the history of the land you work." Fitch called him 3 days later. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Fitch was a third-generation ranch manager whose family had come to Nevada in the 1950s. He hadn't known any of this. He asked Iggy what he wanted. "Nothing," Iggy said. "I already did what I wanted. I put the history where it could be seen." "That's all." "That's everything," Iggy said. "My grandfather said knowledge is what they couldn't take. I made sure they can't take this either." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said finally. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family." "You didn't do it," Iggy said, "but thank you for saying it." The Sterling stayed in Iggy's shop until 2001, when he was 80 years old, and his daughter convinced him that Nevada desert recovery work was too physically demanding. "Truck still runs," Iggy said. "That's not the point," his daughter said. Iggy looked at the Sterling, sitting in the shop where it had sat for 52 years. Chalky, faded red, barely readable lettering, the tool compartment that had carried his grandfather's evidence for 60 years. "All right," he said, "but it goes somewhere people can see it." The Nevada State Museum in Carson City took it. They restored it carefully, keeping all of Iggy's modifications intact, and built a display connecting the truck to the land grant documentation and the Basque immigration history it represented. The plaque reads, 1949 Sterling S-Series Wrecker. Operator, Inazio Iggy, Arusha, 1949-2001. This vehicle recovered a $3.1 million pump station from an underground cavity in Ruby Valley in 1994 when Nevada engineers declared recovery impossible. Its tool compartment carried evidence of the Arusha family's stolen land claim for 60 years. The truck outlasted the injustice. So did the family. Inazio Arusha died in 2008 at the age of 87. His funeral was held at the Star Hotel in Elko, which had been the center of Basque community life in Nevada for a century. Gerald Fitch came. He sat in the front row, which surprised people who didn't know the story and which made complete sense to those who did. At the reception afterward, Fitch found Iggy's daughter and handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "A donation to the Basque Cultural Center," Fitch said, "for the Heritage Program, in your grandfather's name and your great-grandfather's." She opened the envelope, her eyes widened. "This is $50,000. Your family built something in this valley and lost it," Fitch said. "My syndicate has operated on that land for 60 years and made a good living from it. 50,000 is the smallest acknowledgement I can make." She looked at the check for a moment. Then she said something Fitch would remember for the rest of his life. "My great-grandfather's letter said they couldn't take the knowledge. He was right, but it also said do what you think is right." She folded the check carefully. "I think he'd say you did." The 1949 Sterling still sits in the Nevada State Museum. Next to it is the authenticated Spanish land grant, Paxie's letter, and a photograph of Iggy taken at the Ruby Valley Ranch in 1994, covered in limestone dust, standing beside his truck, expression as calm as the desert he'd worked for 50 years. Every summer, on the hottest afternoon in August, someone from the Elko Basque community drives to Carson City and leaves a small piece of Ruby Mountains limestone on the Sterling's running board. A reminder that some things taken by law can be restored by truth. That some knowledge survives everything, drought, fraud, 60 years in a tool compartment, and the particular silence of men who decided that rebuilding mattered more than fighting. And that's sometimes the most powerful thing an old man can do with an old truck is show up, do the work, and let the history speak for itself. The ranchers said nothing could pull it out. The old man fired up his 1949 Sterling and proved that desert knowledge runs deeper than any cavity, and that what his grandfather hid in the frame of a truck was worth more than the land they tried to take. They could survey the land, they could paper over the claim, they could file the documents and collect the deed. But they couldn't take what Patsy Arusha knew. And they couldn't take what he left behind.